Hey friends, it's Len from 1A Auto. Today we've got another top 5 problems for you. This one's going to be on a Gen 1 Ford Explorer Sport Trac. The generation's going to go from 2001 to 2005. With that said, let's get started. Okay friends, for our first problem, we're going to start sitting right inside the vehicle. What we're going to be looking at is right up here, and that's the dash gauge cluster. A lot of times what happens on these is you might happen to notice that the gauge cluster turns on and off by itself. That's going to happen when the key isn't even in the on position. What you might also notice when this is happening is the radio is going to do the same. It's going to kind of flicker on and off, and like I said, the key is not even in the on position for this when it happens. Some of the reasons why this might happen is there might be an issue with your wiring that leads to the back of the cluster. Whether it's a break in the wire or a break in a couple of the wires where they're kind of connecting or maybe grounding out onto something, that's going to of course cause electrical issues, and you might notice that this happens. Otherwise, what you might happen to notice is that there's an issue with the actual back of the gauge cluster where the pins that the connector from the wiring is supposed to go into are either broken, peened over, or even missing. If that's the case, what of course you would have to do is to replace the gauge cluster on the back if you can't repair the pins, and then of course you would move along from there. But generally speaking, if you're having this issue, it's usually either due to the wires having an issue, maybe a mouse got in the house, or even like I said, the back of the cluster has a problem with the pins, and it can either be corrected by fixing it or it would have to be replaced overall. Now for our second problem, we're going to continue on to a long/hard start of your vehicle. What I mean by that is you take your key, you put it in the ignition, and you go to start it. Maybe the engine tries to turn over, and then finally it kicks on, and then of course your engine's running. Overall, when you turn your key, it should start pretty much immediately, if not within the first second or so. With this case scenario, it's going to take a couple more seconds than what it should, and it might make you a little bit nervous. Now the most common cause for this would be a fuel rail pressure sensor, so that of course would be the first place that I would check, but other possible causes for this could potentially be a bad ignition coil, or even the engine crank sensor. Now, since I said that the most common issue for this would be the fuel rail pressure sensor, the first thing I would like to check is the fuel pressure itself. You're going to need one of these gauges, and you're going to have to hook it up to your fuel system. Once you've done that, what you would want to do is put the key in the on position, and you want to watch that gauge to see how fast it comes up to its maximum level of pressure. If it comes up a little bit slow, more than likely you have a blockage someplace, or you have an issue where it's not building up enough pressure. You could even potentially have a little bit of a leak. Speaking of a leak though, if you did happen to notice that that pressure came shooting up, and then maybe you waited 5, 10, 15 minutes, and you saw that needle go boop, 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 start dropping down, especially if it went down fast, that's going to tell you that you have an issue with a fuel pressure regulator. Obviously, it would be helpful to know where the fuel pressure is supposed to be at for this. So of course, you'd want to check your manual and find out where the actual fuel pressure is supposed to be at per the manufacturer's original design. If the fuel pressure, when you just turned the key and you had it in the on position without starting, was very low or too low to actually start the vehicle, well then of course you're going to have an issue. If for some reason there was an issue with the regulator and the pressure was kind of going down and it lost its prime to the fuel injectors up at the engine, well of course you're going to have a long crank because the fuel pump's going to have to pump pressure all the way up to those injectors again. So you're going to notice a long boom, and then it might pick up. And once you're sure that that's all up to spec the way that it should be, of course you'd want to start the vehicle and run it, and you're going to watch that fuel pressure still and make sure it's right up to spec where it's supposed to be. You also want to make sure that you have vacuum going down to that sensor, because if it's not getting the proper amount of vacuum, it's not going to be able to function properly. It might also be helpful if you have access to a scanner of some sort. That way there you'll be able to graph the information to be able to find out if you have too high or even too low of fuel pressure with the scanner. Now for the third problem on this vehicle, I'm going to talk about the blend door actuator. Some of the symptoms that you might happen to notice is when you take your temperature gauge, assuming you have a manual gauge, and you go to switch it from cold all the way over to hot, you might hear a little thumping, a ticking, or even a clunking noise coming from behind your dash. Other things you might happen to notice if you're having a blend door actuator issue is maybe you just go ahead and turn it, and for some reason the heat's still coming out of the vents and it hasn't actually switched to cold if you were switching from hot to cold, or vice versa. If you happen to notice it makes that clunking noise when you move your temperature gauge right here, more than likely it's due to the fact that either your actuator itself, which is located behind here like I said, or even the housing where the blend door is cracked. If you have a crack in the plastic, it's going to of course cause an issue where the two parts aren't going to be able to mesh perfectly, and the actuator might be functioning and turning the way that it should, but the blend door is actually kind of skipping inside of the groove for the blend door. Of course, if the plastic is broken on either the actuator or of course the blend door mechanism, you're going to have an issue where the two pieces aren't actually copacetic anymore, and of course one piece is going to be able to spin outside of the other, and it's not going to be able to push that blend door the way that it needs to. Another reason why that might actually happen and the crack might happen is maybe something fell inside one of your vents, maybe you have some children or anything like that, or you keep stuff up on your dash. If anything was to fall inside the vents and make its way down inside the venting, it could actually bind up that blend door, so even though this is doing its job and it's telling the actuator to go ahead and move it from hot to cold, the blend door inside is actually stuck on something such as maybe a pencil or a toy or anything else. Aside from a cracked plastic issue or even a binding issue, you might find that you have a power issue. If for some reason the actuator isn't getting the power that it needs to be able to switch this like it's supposed to, of course it's not going to be able to function right. So of course you want to make sure you check your fuses to make sure everything's going right there, and of course make sure there's power going to that actuator. Now to get to your actuator slash blend door, it's not going to be the easiest thing to do. What you're going to need to do is get all this completely out of the way, and then to get to the actuator, it's going to be located up and behind this area of the dash in the center. And then once you get to that point, of course, you'd want to check for power. You'd want to disconnect that connector from the actual actuator, and you want to make sure there's no corrosion or anything funny going on with that. Then, of course, remove the actuator from the unit, plug it back in, and retry it. Make sure that the actuator is working the way that it should. Also, while you have it out, it couldn't hurt to, of course, take a peek to make sure you don't see any obstructions where the blend door is supposed to be, and then, of course, go from there. Now, for the fourth problem that I want to talk about on these vehicles involves the 4.0 engines. If you were to look right over here in the front of the engine, you're going to find the thermostat housing. Symptoms of a coolant leak, of course, would be if you have a sweet smell in the air. Another symptom might be you have moisture around some of your coolant parts, maybe even a little puddle on the ground. Sometimes when you have a coolant leak, you don't even really see a puddle, but you definitely know something's going on because, like I said, you can smell it, and maybe you even notice that you have an overheating condition. And of course, your coolant could just be low in general. When it comes time to fixing it, one of the first things that I would like to try to do is to pressure test the system, especially if I can't physically see a leak anywhere. All you do is you'd, of course, open up your radiator, assuming that it's nice and cold, and then you'd hook up your pressure tester to it and pump it right up to approximately 15 to 16 psi. Then let it sit. Watch that gauge. If it seems like it goes right up, that's great. And then if it seems like it drops down, well, that means, of course, you're losing pressure. If you're losing pressure, it must be going somewhere, and it's probably more than likely an external leak, especially on this vehicle, which would be the thermostat housing right there. The reason why the thermostat housing tends to leak is because it's plastic and it cracks over time. It's super common for these, and Ford actually updated it to a metal housing instead. So, of course, what you would want to do is drain out the cooling system, flush out the cooling system, replace the part that needs to be replaced, which is this whole unit right along there, and then, of course, you would go ahead and fill it up with the manufacturer specified fluid. Repressurize the system, and you should be good to go. Okay, now the fifth problem on this particular vehicle involves the front wheel bearings. Some of the symptoms that you might happen to notice if you have worn or bad bearings in the front would be a growling noise as you spin the wheel, or even driving down the road. Maybe you're driving down the road and you happen to hear roar. You turn the wheel a little bit, maybe the noise gets a little less. Roar. Turn it the other way, roar. Even worse. Generally what that means is if you have a growl noise coming from the front and it changes with either speed or, of course, the turning of the vehicle, that's telling you that you have an issue with your wheel bearing. Another symptom that you might happen to notice if you have a really bad wheel bearing would be a clunking, either in the 12 and 6 position if you're moving it like this, or even 3 and 9. If the wheel can do this, or even like this, you know you more than likely have an issue with your wheel bearing. Of course, you'd want to check out the rest of your front end as well to make sure you don't have an issue with the ball joint, upper or lower, or even the tie rod. But more than likely, if it goes all 4 ways like that, you have an issue with the wheel bearings. Or you might happen to notice when you're driving down the road, you have to do this a little bit with your steering wheel because the steering feels a little loose. So some of the causes for this would be the fact that the wheel bearings are actually made to be manually adjustable as opposed to being a sealed unit. With it being that way, there's supposed to be a seal that's on the back side of that rotor that's going to hold the moisture from getting into where the bearings are. And it's also going to help keep the grease into where the bearings are. If, of course, the seal is in poor condition and it's letting moisture in or grease out, you're going to find that you have an issue with those bearings. Also, like I said, with the bearings being manually adjusted, they have a nut that's right on the front side there. If that's out of adjustment and it's not putting enough pressure on the bearings, you're going to have some movement. You might happen to notice this after you replace your bearings and you pack them full of grease and then you go ahead and put everything back together with a nice new seal as you should. You go ahead and tighten up that nut. You don't want to make it very tight because, of course, you don't want to bind anything up. But you make it perfectly tight, it's adjusted the way that it should be, you put your cotter pin back in there, you put your cover on, you put the wheel back on, you take it for a road test. Seems fine. You drive it for maybe a month or so, you're driving down the road, you start hearing a little bit of noise again, maybe even a clunk over bumps. What's going on? I just fixed my wheel bearing. You jack it back up, you take that wheel, boom, 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 boom. Well, the reason for that is pretty common. When you go to adjust the nut, especially when you just packed brand new grease inside the rotor, as the grease starts to heat up, it's gonna start to liquefy a little bit and it's gonna kind of maybe smush in. When that happens, the bearings are gonna be able to press further together and the nut isn't gonna be as tight as what it was, and then you're gonna notice that movement, so it's gonna need readjustment. If you happen to notice that the seal on the back side there was damaged and you had moisture getting in, you're probably also gonna notice that there's damage to your bearings. You'll probably also notice that there's damage to your bearing if you can do this with your wheel back and forth. More than likely you've done some pretty good damage to your bearings. Also, if there isn't enough grease inside there to lubricate the bearings as they're spinning around with the wheel, they're gonna overheat and you're also gonna notice damage. When I say damage, essentially what I mean is if you had the bearing out, you have it nice and clean, you could take the bearing and the cage and rattle it around like this. It's supposed to move a little bit, but it's not supposed to move a lot of it. If you're just servicing your bearings and you happen to notice that the bearings themselves are scored due to maybe overheating or less lubricity than what should have been in there, possibly even a little bit of debris getting in, more than likely it's a good idea to just go ahead and replace those bearings. When you replace them, you don't want to just put grease all around them and hope that that's good enough. You actually have to pack the grease right into the bearings. They sell a little cup that you can press it in there and it's going to fill those bearings up for you. Also, not just that, but when you're putting in the bearings, you want to make sure that there's a good amount of grease inside the center area between the bearings inside the rotor. You don't want to put too much because of course it could make an issue where the bearing isn't going to be able to force its way in far enough as you tighten it. You might think that the nut's tight, but it really isn't. And then of course when you drive down the road, the grease kind of makes its way out and then that wheel's going to be able to wobble around a lot. So with that said, when it comes time to servicing or even adjusting your front wheel bearings, because maybe you just have a little bit of noise, you're going to want to make sure that you do it right and you're going to want to make sure that you double check it within a first couple hundred miles. And whether you're servicing the bearings or even replacing the bearings, it's always a great idea to make sure you use new grease and you always need to replace the seal. Okay friends, so that's pretty much everything I've got for the top problems on this particular vehicle. Every vehicle has an issue, otherwise I probably wouldn't have a job. With that said, I hope you learned a little something in the video. If you did and you want to talk about it, leave it in the comment section below because I always love to hear from you. If you like the video, smash on that like button for me, it would mean the world. While you're at it, why don't you go ahead and subscribe and ring the bell, that way there you can be kept up with all of our latest content. Thanks.